I was born in Akron, Ohio. I spent the first 23 years of my life in Ohio. Did 2 years at Kent State. When I finally figured out I wanted to be a political scientist, I transferred to the Ohio State University. And then I ended up spending 10 years in New York City, doing grad school and jobs and that sort of thing. And then the last 20 years, I have been here in Washington, D.C. Half that time, I worked in the Library of Congress as a nonpartisan civil servant, helping members of Congress and congressional staff. It's a really neat job. It's an agency called the Congressional Research Service. And that job really got me interested in the election issue because I worked with hundreds of staff and many members every single year. And I did that for 11 years. And one thing I kept noticing about legislators and Congress was they spent an awful lot of time engaged in symbolic activity. You know, they're here under the dome, this ornate dome in Washington, D.C. They have a job to do. They have a huge agenda, dozens and dozens and dozens of issues to tackle. And a lot of valuable time was being spent on behavior and activities that was not actually moving policy forward, was not actually improving governance in any way, shape, or form. I also noticed that a significant amount of their time was devoted to what appeared to me to be just gratuitous conflict, just picking fights over stuff with no desire to resolve the situation, to fix the problem that is being raised. Hey, I just kept watching it and I kind of, the middle America bias is, they're just politicians. What do you expect? But the more I watched them, the more I realized that these are rational actors operating in a system or game that has incentives. They're not doing this stuff just for kicks. They are doing it because it is a vehicle for getting reelected. And the path to reelection, for so many of them in Congress, runs through a partisan primary, and on average, only about 20% of eligible voters turn out for a primary. And it's winner take all, typically in your partisan primaries. And so these politicians, particularly those in the House of Representatives who have to run every 2 years, are constantly looking over their shoulders and going, am I going to be primaried from the right or the left? And how can I engage in various activities that kind of shore up my cred with those really intense base voters on the right, if that's my party, or on the left? Thus, this is what we get. Lots of time in Congress being spent on messaging bills, being spent on activities like aggressive oversight that's not really aimed at solving a problem or figuring out why something is not working, but rather is devoted to giving members the opportunity to grandstand, which if all that time is being spent on those activities, well, guess what? It's not being spent on the things that we actually want them to do, the vast majority of people. It's about pleasing the base on either side. So that's a problem for representative government. And when it carries on for a long, long time, well, no surprise, you get public opinion of government and Congress going down. And we're at a spot right now for the last 30 years, public with the exception of 9/11, over the last 30 years, approval of Congress has pretty much hovered between 10% and 40%. And that's lower than it was in mid-20th century. So there's this kind of widespread disgust. You've got politicians' behavior being what it shouldn't be. So I started thinking like, well, there's an electoral collection. Duh. These guys are doing what they can to get reelected. And this is where ranked choice voting very quickly popped up when I was looking at possible ways to fix the situation. Ranked choice voting is a way to change the rules of the game so that politicians feel different incentives. They feel less incentive to run far left and far right, and more incentive to figure out where most voters are at. And that's just flipping the script from where we are right now. And that's really interesting. And, I'm I am not on the political left. I'm on the political right. Um, and when I think about RCV, I often hear friends of mine on the right say, "Oh, this is kind of some newfangled liberal idea." In fact, ranked choice voting as a concept goes back more than a century. And for those of you, you probably know this, Ohio did all sorts of experimenting with a variant of ranked choice voting. Uh, Ashtabula, Cincinnati, Hamilton, Toledo, Cleveland, they all, for varying degrees of time, use ranked choice voting. I think like Hamilton had it until 1961, or maybe it was another town. So there's this long local history with it in Ohio. And I try to bring this up when I talk to people on the political right, like who call themselves conservatives. You want to conserve what's important. Well, you know what's important? This is part of our political history. And this was something that was used, but then got wrecked in all the places that it had been started, because guess what? The politically entrenched interests kept finding themselves being frustrated by the system. They couldn't play the game and get what they wanted, so they decided to change the game back. So, yeah, I think I'm very excited to be amongst you guys. I'm very excited that all this is happening. We need more political innovation occurring, more governance innovation. Systems are not going to fix themselves. In fact, systems tend to break themselves over time. They get worse and worse, just like software you don't update. So kudos to you all. And, if anybody ever asks you like, oh, is RCV a new thing? As I've said, no, it's not. I'm a political scientist. I've read the research. A lot of people will say, oh, well, RCV, like what bad things are going to happen if we try this different way of doing it? The answer is, I've read the literature. I can't find bad things. What I tend to see is mostly good things. Higher turnout, moderation in candidates. Sometimes political campaigning is less toxic. Voters have more choice. There's no evidence of bad things like people get confused about the ballot. No, not really. You can give people a very simple ballot and they could still screw it up. That happens all the time. Ask any election administrator. So it's all good. All right, it's 2:26, and I want to leave time for Q&A, and I certainly don't want to delay the raffle.
It's okay. Don't worry about the timing of that. Well, someone will get an email and find out, and then we'll come back to that afterward. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. But I want to start off with one because Kevin and I actually got breakfast when he was visiting Ohio for the holidays, and Kevin had some great sports metaphors for how ranked choice voting can make elections more competitive in the way that sports rules have changed over time in order to make sports more competitive. So Kevin, could you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point of elections is to have a point. And we can debate what the point might be. But there is a goal, and there is supposed to be a popularly desirable goal. We may want people elected who are much more representative of the average voter. We might want people who are inclined to believe that they'll be rewarded for doing the hard work of governance, writing laws and studying social problems and complicated issues and doing your homework and grinding through that whole sort of process. We may want a system that does that sort of thing. Yeah, when it comes to sports, like, look, baseball played today is obviously not the baseball played 100 years ago. Football assuredly is not the sport that it was played even 20 years ago, to say nothing of, 40 years ago when guys could, absolutely take one another's heads off. The rules have been changed because there's an element, I'll stick with football, of the game getting worse because it's mutual assured destruction. Clotheslining. You could do that 50, 60 years ago in football. Just take out your arm and take another guy's head off who was running with the ball. You could head slap, but they could also do it to you. And for a while, this sort of bad behavior was allowed on the field. And fans took some entertainment in it, but the damage was significant, not least to the players. But also the game itself seemed to be less about athleticism and more about who could maim the other person. And so they cleaned the game up. This is a cycle that happened in sports, particularly football. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, as president, leaned in to try to save football from ruining itself due to an excess of violence 100 years ago. So I think, when we look at the kind of standard way that we run elections with partisan primaries and a general turnout where the ballot is limited to candidates from the two major parties, we see that each party and candidates have figured out really how to run within this system in the most efficient way. Targeted messaging, particularly at the primary level, to turn out high intensity voters. They realize the social science is clear. Negativity also turns out those very same voters. So they're going to harp on negative stuff. They're not going to run a positive campaign with a lot of solutions. It's going to be a lot of anger and fist pounding to rile up voters. But of course, that creates a collective effect of voters getting stressed out because you keep hearing everything is bad. And it's gotten to the point now where both the parties, because of the sheer competition and the desire to win and the data, they're running basically apocalyptic politics campaigns. The right is basically saying the left is going to destroy this country, and the left is saying the same thing of the right. And they've just got things amped up to such a high level, you kind of wonder, like, how are you guys going to do something prosaic like pass a transportation bill? Because all you're talking about is woke versus fascist. So yeah, absolutely. The game of politics is in a bad place.
Thanks, Kevin. I also liked, since it's March Madness season, you also had a basketball metaphor about how before they had the shot clock, then the offensive team could just run out the clock. But it takes that, changing the incentive of the rules of the game in order to make the game more competitive and more participatory and interesting. We have two questions in the chat from Jim Warner, who is our Southwest Ohio lead. For context, for everyone who's here, there are actually different ways of doing ranked choice voting. There's a model that is used in Maine that has closed primaries, and another that's used in Alaska that has open primaries. And so Jim asks how Kevin feels about the open primary model of ranked choice voting.
I'm intrigued by it. I'm glad to see it is being tested in various places. To be sure, there are parts of this country that have used open primaries forever. The jungle primaries of Louisiana, that sort of thing. They've been around forever. But it was really cool to see New York City run an open primary in its mayoral race. The mayoral race for New York City is historically low turnout and boring. Why? Because you always know the Democrat's going to win, and the Democrat is going to win the particular Democrat who will win is more than likely the person with the biggest bag of money. That's just the way it tends to work. The only time that you have exceptions to that rule is when you have somebody like Mike Bloomberg decides to register as a nominal Republican, but he's actually a Democrat, sort of thing, and then he's got a big bag of money and runs. Well, when it was rolled out this last time around, there was something like 60 candidates who jumped in, and they jumped in because A, we had an open primary, but B, they also knew that after the primary, that there was a ranked choice voting exercise. And the idea was like, man, if I could just hang around long enough, and be likable to enough voters, then maybe I can have a chance. The ultimate result of the election, I think, was pretty good. Had it been run in its standard way, you would have had probably somebody who was pretty far left elected as mayor. Instead, you got Eric Adams, a former cop, who was picked in large part because a lot of people in New York City were really concerned about crime. Didn't matter if they're left, right, white minority, that's where their anxieties were, and he was the candidate that kind of met the median vote on their highest issue. So yeah, I'm good on those on experimentation with that. But I'll have to say, ranked choice voting worked out pretty good in the Virginia governor's race too. Republicans were trying to figure out how they could pick a good candidate to take on Terry McAuliffe, who'd been governor before, big, huge player in Democratic politics, had an unbelievable amount of money, and Virginia is a purple state. So it was going to be an uphill battle. And they decided that when they were going to pick their candidate, they ran a Republican convention that was both in person and virtual. So if you're a member of the GOP, you could participate. And they used ranked choice voting to try to figure out which candidate to run. And that's how they ended up with Glenn Youngkin. And Glenn Youngkin was clearly the strongest of the bunch. He was not as Trumpy as some of the others. And had they run a straight primary system, Youngkin probably wouldn't have won. So that ranked choice voting was an explicit choice to produce a candidate who would have crossover appeal. They knew they could get Democrats vote if they used RCV, and so they did. And Glenn Youngkin won the governorship. So it can work either way.
Thanks, Kevin. We have a couple comments that are sort of related that you may be interested in responding to. One is from Jim Warner. It says, "It seems to me that RCV corrects the disenfranchisement of independent candidates." And Dennis Lambert says, "Every election is the most important election in history, but nothing has ever changed. The voters need more power in their votes."
Yeah. Just quick response to Dennis is, I mean, it feels to me like the way campaigns work is a little bit like the way soft drinks are being advertised today. Everything is more extreme with more creatine, more caffeine, more, and the campaigns are doing the same thing, but the rhetoric versus the reality, the gulf is large. The disenfranchisement question, it corrects the disenfranchisement of independent candidates, but it can also correct the disenfranchisement of independent voters. I'm registered independent in Washington, D.C., and I'm not allowed to participate in a primary, period. I'm just not allowed. And if you're an independent who wants to run for office in here, it's a fool's errand. You don't have a chance because the system is structured to make sure that you don't win. So yeah. I mean, that was the fun thing. And again, looking at New York City is that the number of non-Democrats, non-Republicans who decided to throw their hats in, who thought they would actually have a chance, who in previous years, they wouldn't have done it.